Okay, so good morning, Professor Alison McEwen. Thank you very much for attending GPS on, which is a genomic podcast show. And today we're really glad and we're honored to have Professor Alison McEwen in our session. And she has quite a history. I think currently, please correct me if I'm wrong, but currently you are the president of Human Genetic Society in Australasia and is actually the head of a discipline, I think, yeah, a training discipline for genetic counseling in University of Technology, Sydney.
Yeah, not the head anymore. So I was part of establishing the discipline of genetic counselling at University of Technology in Sydney, but I've stepped down from the role as head now and focusing on some new projects.
I see.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
from our understanding, this is us from Genomic Solidaritas Indonesia. Genetic counseling is when you explain, you help to communicate with the patients when they have a result of some kind of genetic testing, whether it's for rare diseases or maybe for inherited diseases, for example. So that sounds like a very niche concept. Maybe you could explain how you dive into that world in general, please.
Yeah, so I guess a niche concepts and well, it probably doesn't feel like that to me because I'm so involved in the profession and in the work, but certainly it's an area which is really rapidly growing as the genetic and genomic technology has developed so much over the past 20 or 30 years, um, and at the same time as that technology has been developing, we've begun to understand more and more about how much support and information people might need in order to access the things that genomic technology have to offer in terms of healthcare. And so where genetic counsellors started initially, and my career goes back 30 years, I think. Well, not quite 30 years, maybe 25 years. I've been involved in genetic counselling. And when we started, things like genetic testing for hereditary breast cancer and ovarian cancer was only just becoming something that we could offer in a clinical setting. And that was in New Zealand, where I'm from.
Right.
And of course now, as we talked about, as we were starting to discuss how this podcast would go, now we can do things like the non-invasive prenatal testing and the pre-implantation genetic testing options and all sorts of other things. And so genetic counsellors have a role in facilitating the decision making that people might make as they consider having a genetic or genomic test, or as they hope to learn more about particular conditions that might be being passed down through their family.
Right.
So part of it is around working with individuals and families who've got a family history of an inherited condition. But of course, the other thing that's happening is that people are beginning to have what we might call treatment-focused testing. So they might be having some testing to help decide what the best treatment option is for a cancer, for example.
Right.
And as part of that, sometimes information is discovered that's useful for other members of the family. And so genetic counsellors have a role in helping other health professionals to facilitate family communication. So there's lots of roles for genetic counsellors, really.
All that different roles from cancer testing targeted, testing target test,
Mm.
and then or rare diseases, or the more currently what we discuss about NIPT and PGT, for example. So what kind of subjects, what kind of training that a genetic counselor needs?
So genetic counsellors, obviously I'm working in genetic counsellor education and training, and so at the moment in Australia and New Zealand and some other parts of the world, the training for genetic counsellors is postgraduate training.
I see.
And so students would usually have some education in genetics and genomics before they come into a postgraduate training program for genetic counsellors.
Okay.
And then once they come into that program, what we teach them to do is to apply that knowledge about genetics and genomics. And so we teach them counselling skills and communication skills around healthcare communication. And they learn all about all the different aspects of clinical genetic counselling. They also learn about research,
Right. Okay.
because genetic counsellors use research in our work, and so we need to understand how that research is produced. And then they have clinical experiences as part of the training as well. So,
Right. I see.
yeah.
Okay. So it's a postgraduate, but the undergraduate can be anything, or does it have to relate to
It can
medical
be
doctor?
anything. So,
Okay.
yeah, so anything that that demonstrates that a prospective student is interested in working with people, and that they can meet their academic requirements to go into postgraduate training.
Right.
And then if they haven't studied genetics and genomics in their undergraduate degree, they can do that before they apply for the training program. But I guess among colleagues who I have as genetic counsellors, there are people who come from a science background and who often have worked as laboratory scientists or
Wow.
cytogeneticists. There are people who come from social work or nursing and midwifery type backgrounds.
Yeah, I think
My
that would be
background
very
was in,
relevant for them, yeah.
yeah, and
Midwifery.
yeah, absolutely. And then my background was in education. So people come into it from all sorts of different
Right.
walks of life and backgrounds. Yeah.
So what's the knowledge of the public or the clinical community about genetic counseling? Because I would imagine that a patient, I'm not sure about New Zealand or Australia, but even here in Indonesia, after a patient receives a result, for example, naturally they will come back to their main doctors to come
Mm.
for the counseling or for the explanation. How is it in Australia?
Mm.
Yeah.
So it's quite varied, I guess, in terms of how much people know about the existence of genetic counsellors. There are maybe getting close to 500 members of our professional society across Australia and New Zealand. So,
Okay.
so we are growing as a profession, but a lot of people wouldn't be aware that that they could go and see a genetic counsellor. And then if their doctor knows about it and refers them to see a genetic counsellor, they often don't know what to expect when they come to see us. So part of what we often do early on is in an appointment is to find out from the person what they're expecting and what would be helpful, and to talk with them about what we can offer. in
Right.
an appointment. So some of that education for the public happens through, this is what a
Right.
genetic counselor can do while you're seeing one. Yeah.
Right. And like as far as your memory goes, do they come from referral or do people actively seek genetic counseling?
So a bit of both.
Oh, okay.
So I worked clinically in New Zealand for 16 years, and actually last year I did a small amount of clinical work back in New Zealand as well. And so the practice is often so usually we would like to have a referral from either a person's general practitioner, so their primary doctor,
Right.
or from a specialist. But if a family is already known to a genetic service, we would often accept a self-referral. So if somebody in the family has already been seen, and and perhaps their sister would like to come along, they can self-refer to the service.
Huh. I see.
Yeah.
So, with that 500 members that you said and growing, and I'm sure it'll be growing quick enough,
Yeah.
what is the main concern, maybe in the different time frames, like when you had like 100 members and then 300 and 500? I mean, like in terms of concern of the diseases, for example, like this is such a difficult disease to explain. Like, do you talk about it in a meeting somehow, or maybe the concern is more about like not enough, let's say, not enough GPs referring to us, like what kind of difficulties do you
Mm.
face as a growing genetic counseling community, I say?
Yeah. So I guess so that's our professional society, and if I think back, over the years, a lot of the issues that have concerned our professional society have been um, about developing training and certification pathways for
Right.
genetic counselors. So about how do we develop and establish ourselves as a profession. And then we've also thought a lot about how do we establish, I guess, a regulatory framework so that
I
that
see.
there is some recognition about public safety for people when they go and see a genetic counsellor, in the same way that we think about that regulatory framework that goes around other types of health professionals. And then we've thought, we've I guess, a current concern for us as a profession in Australia and New Zealand is around the funding for
Mm,
genetic counsellor roles. So, how much is the government and the public health service funding roles, and for genetic counsellors who are working in private, how can they, you know,
right.
bill for that activity? So probably as a professional community, a big part of our focus has been on becoming a profession, and and establishing all the different things that professions need around education and training, and then that kind of regulatory framework.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine that was, I guess you need to communicate with a lot of different sectors because
Yep.
the regulatory comes from government and then the recognition comes from different professional bodies. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's
And then
somewhat
and
similar.
then also thinking about how have other allied health professions like genetic counselors done this. And um, yeah, so there's been a lot of work um, to establish us as
Right.
a profession, really.
Yeah, so when you say allied health sectors, right?
Mm.
Then I'm pretty sure some of them have done bits of genetic counseling here and there because
Yep.
they've been, they faced those situations before. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you see genetic counselor being unique among that? Like, well, what's the additional, points or services that a genetic counselor is
Yeah, I think
capable of giving?
that's a great question, and it's one that that we think about as a group of genetic counselors as well, around um, what is the I guess what is unique about what we do, and how do we add value in the
Add
health
value.
system. Um, and I think that's still an area where there's a lot of research that's being done to look at the outcomes that are so what are the outcomes for patients who've seen a genetic counsellor compared with the outcomes for patients who have something very similar happening but haven't seen a genetic counsellor. So that's part of it. And I think the other part that we're thinking a lot about is around, I guess, there is the activity of genetic counselling. And as you say, um, a lot of healthcare professionals and medical professionals will do part of the activity of genetic counselling. So they might do that when they're consenting someone for a genetic test,
Yeah.
or returning the result. And alongside that, genetic counsellors are the experts in all of that activity of genetic counselling. So,
Right.
so we can work with our colleagues in the medical professions and in other healthcare professions to support them to do parts of that activity, and then there are a group of patients for whom they will be best served if they come and see a genetic counsellor.
What's the differentiation then between that two
Yeah,
groups?
great. I think that's totally a good
Yeah.
question. So, and we don't totally know the answer to that,
Right.
but there are
Okay.
groups
Okay.
that are researching. But I think if we think about, if we go back to maybe the non-invasive prenatal testing.
Right.
So somebody's pregnant and they have a non-invasive an NIPT
Yeah.
test, and they get a low risk result. I think, a midwife or a obstetrician or a general practitioner can
They can explain it.
totally
Yeah.
look after that person really well.
Yeah.
If somebody has NIPT and they get an increased risk result, sometimes the pathway seems straightforward for that person in terms of, will they go on to any further testing and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But for some people, it's really helpful to see a genetic counsellor when they've got that increased risk result and they're wanting to understand what it means for them.
Right. Right.
As a couple. So that would be one difference. And I could give you an example from oncology as well, so from cancer treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps somebody has got a breast cancer and they're quite young, and their oncologist says to them, let's do some genetic testing for the high risk breast cancer genes, and we'll use that information to help plan your treatment.
Right.
So that she has her blood test and she has her testing, and the test comes back and says, oh, you've got a pathogenic variant in a breast cancer gene.
Mm-hmm.
And so the oncologist gives her that result and says, what this means for you in terms of your treatment is, whatever it means, and says, this has got implications for your family.
Right.
And So, and would you like to go and talk with a genetic counsellor about what it means for your family? So, so the oncologist manages what it means for the cancer and the cancer treatment, and the genetic counsellor works with the patient around, around what it means for her family. Yeah. So it's a couple of examples. Yeah.
That sounds very relevant because, as you said, for example, in the breast cancer risk, yeah, you're right that the consequences kind of goes down the family too, and that might need to be communicated more, how to communicate this to their family, and
Yeah.
to find the next steps of what's best to do. So I guess
absolutely.
addition of knowing that they themselves are having cancer. So
yeah. And so they might come, sometimes people will come as a family to see a genetic counsellor. So you might see somebody with their sister and their daughter, or something. So the family might come together to talk about what it means.
Right. Yeah.
It
sounds like a very it sounds very specific when you talk about it that way. It sounds like a very step-by-step system. So I'm sure this has come from a long history of discussions and forums.
Yeah.
So how did it, I guess the very first question is like, how did it come to that? Like, how did formal clinical genetic training in New Zealand or Australia come about?
So it's interesting. I was talking with a very esteemed genetic counselling professional yesterday. His name is Professor John Weil, and he wrote one of the early books about genetic counselling. And I was talking with him yesterday, and we were talking about how genetic counselling as we know it today had its origins in kind of the late 1960s and early 1970s in North America. So, in fact, in New York State, I think, in North America. So it really came out of a very specific time and place. And so in North America have been genetic counsellors for just over 50 years. In Australia and New Zealand, the profession is a bit more recent. So we've probably had genetic counsellors for about 30 years. And I guess it grew out of a recognition that there were people, families and individuals with conditions that were thought to be inherited, who valued an opportunity to talk about what that meant to them and to their family. And so it really has become a process of we talk about facilitating their adaptation to that condition. So kind of getting used to the idea of the inherited condition in the family. So that's really where it has come from. It's come from being quite a niche, quite specialized field where we in the past worked with very small numbers of people with often very rare conditions. And I think this conversation that we were having yesterday was really about how the world has changed so much, and so if we think about genetic counselling today and genetic counselling in countries like Indonesia, it's likely to look very, very different from
Yeah, I
what
would
it
think
looked
so.
like in 1970s America. And I think that's something that so makes me excited to think about how can we take the things that are good and important from genetic counselling for the people that we work with, the families with these conditions, and how can we adapt and shape them to help them to work in different parts of the world in, in 2023. So massive question, but something that's really,
Yeah, because
something that we should be thinking about.
I imagine because the tools are also very different since the
Mm,
1960s and currently in the 2020. So I would imagine the information is also different and the way to
mm,
communicate is also different. The population also has a very different source of information to come up from. And then
yeah,
how, as
definitely.
you can say, how the genetic counselors can value add onto that information. I think that's a very
Mm,
both chilling and excitement both chilling and exciting situation because like in Indonesia there's only a budding like there's some growth
mm,
towards formal clinical genetics geneticist training or genetic counseling training. So like how do you think, continuing from our discussion, like how do you think this can fit into a just growing system? I mean, compared to North America or Australia, where there's already a system where, as you say,
mm,
there's a way to channel those people that are looking for a genetic counselor. But in
mm,
Indonesia, there's not yet of that. So where do you think we should focus in this term? Like, is it about, yeah, I mean, like in your experience as, you know, an
mm.
educator, since you have an educator background, like, right? So where do we focus? Do we focus on the diseases first, or do we focus on, like you said, the communication aspect of it, how
Mm,
to discuss the results, how to discuss the implications to your immediate family, or do we
mm,
focus on? I mean, I wouldn't say we need to focus on the regulations because there is something that has to happen in the background, yeah.
mm.
So
Yeah,
yeah, what do
yeah,
you
and
think?
yeah, I guess, I mean, that's a massive
A
question.
loaded question.
It's huge question to think about. Where do we start with,
Yeah,
um, I mean, and it's not really where do we start because there are already people who are
doing
doing
great.
aspects of
Yes.
genetic counselling in Indonesia, and there are labs like yours where the technology and the testing is being being done, and
Yeah.
as you said, you've got further developments planned in the lab. Um, so I guess I'm not quite sure where you start, but I think I guess to me the communication is so much a part of what we do, that um, and so much a part of what people often value in healthcare. Um,
Right.
I think we can hear some of the hardest information from, or the most difficult to hear information from our doctors sometimes. And if it's, and often what we remember is not so much the information, but the way that that
That
information's
is
delivered.
true. Yeah.
Um, yeah. And so I guess I think that the communication is really important. And I think helping both the health professionals and or the medical professionals um, to understand the kinds of results that a genetic testing laboratory is able to give, so that then they can communicate them to the patient, is also really a big part of it. Um, And so some of what genetic counselors are doing now is actually working in laboratories
Mm.
and facilitating that space between the medical professional who's ordered a test, they've ordered their NIPT test or something, and then as the scientist, you've done the test, and then you want to report that back and say, well, this person's high risk for a chromosome abnormality, and the medical doctor who's now got to give this result to his patient, he might ring up and say, I've never had to do this before. How can I do this? And so a genetic counsellor might be the person who can coach the doctor through how they might give that result to the patient. Yeah.
That is a real life situation with the new tests coming up, and like there's a lot of new names of diseases sometimes to some GPs. So that is a real life situation right there. Where the GP is like, well, what am I saying to my patient?
Yeah. Absolutely. And for medical professionals, well, for all of us, there is so much information and new things that are flooded into our world all the time. And for a GP, for example, how do they keep up with all that new information? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I apologize for the loaded question, and maybe let me just narrow it down a bit. What kind of advice you can give to a new genetic counselor or someone that wants to learn about genetic counseling? Like, what kind of advice do you give during their training, or maybe any pre-studies that we need to do? Maybe, please.
Yeah. So I guess I've worked with a lot of students over the years, and I think to me, I think as a genetic counsellor, having curiosity and the kind of openness to know that we'll always be learning is really important. And I guess when I think about what I value as a genetic counsellor, I value the immense privilege that I've had over the years to sit with families through some of the really challenging times in their lives, making a really complex decision, and to have that opportunity to sit with people, I think is just, it's immensely special, and it stays with you. And so when I think about people coming into this profession, I hope that they can bring that curiosity and that willingness to reflect and to always learn, and somehow just the willingness to see each person for the unique individual that they are, and to know that we can't ever really know what is going through those people's minds, but we can hold that space for them while they grapple with a decision that they're making. Yeah, not sure if I answered your question.
It kind of, I mean, it does, because I understand that you wanna display this concept of what is important when you're doing the genetic counseling.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I get that, and I'm really impressed on how that relates, because there's a lot of times that sometimes we think the patient may already know what they have to do, but it's not easy for them to explain it to themselves or to people around them. So yeah, it's just something that I take very deeply when you said that there are people that finds value in communicating about this or finding out how to communicate about this. So and I think that's an impressive concept to hold on to when you are starting to train about genetic counseling.
Yeah. If you want to more practical things, I guess, for people who are interested in learning more about genetic counseling, to think about having a really sound understanding of core genetic and genomic
Yeah.
Science as it relates to humans and healthcare, and I think also just that really genuine interest in working with people and with good, with a career that is about communication of often very complex genetic and genomic concepts to a variety of audiences, if you like.
And sometimes
Yeah.
very grim situations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
cancer, I couldn't imagine.
Mm.
So well, yeah, that's been very eye-opening. Maybe just to, summarize in a way. So where do you think genetic or genomic counseling is now, and how do you see this growing in the next, I don't know, 10, 20 years?
Yeah.
Or is it something that you hope, or, is something that we should aspire to as, communities in healthcare, basically?
Mm. So, when I think about the future for genetic counselling, I think it's going to look a little bit different in different parts of the world, um, but I think it is a profession that's going to continue to grow across the world. We and I also think it's going to look different in the different parts of the world. So, in some parts of the world, I think that a lot of the activity of genetic counselling will be done by medical professionals or nurses or midwives, and that they might learn those skills from a smaller group of genetic counsellors in those countries. And then in other parts of the world, I think we will continue to see more and more genetic counsellors employed, including in primary healthcare as well as in hospitals and specialist healthcare. And I also think the skills that genetic counsellors have are very transferable to a number of different environments. So, so we're seeing more genetic counsellors start to work in research, work in laboratories, and that communication between referring doctors and the laboratory scientists. We're seeing genetic counsellors working in policy environments as well. So I think there's a broad range of opportunities out there for genetic counsellors, and how it will look in different countries in the next 10, 20 years is very much dependent on the way that healthcare is delivered in those countries.
Oh dear, that is a loaded answer, especially the last sentence.
Well, I just think I didn't mean it to be loaded. I was thinking about it in terms of in terms of not saying I don't think it has to be all one way. I think that
you're right,
that there's a lot of possibilities out there, and we need to work together to find the ways that will be best for the a particular country.
The conditions.
Yeah, the conditions.
You're right,
absolutely. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I guess from my side, it's more of a, like I said, it's both chilling. Like I'm a bit apprehensive on how it could work, but also excited because I know for sure that in Indonesia, the diseases are a lot in both numbers and variety. So I see that anything that could help will help, in this case, in the terms of the information, communication, and of the decision making at the end of the day. Decision making for both the patients and also for the clinicians. So but when you said something about how it could be delivered differently depending on how the country's healthcare is being delivered, now that comes into a lot of different strings. So Wait, does
Well,
Australia and New Zealand have national insurance? Like Indonesia has national health insurance. So
so does that mean that healthcare is through a public health system, so
yes, yeah,
everybody's got access? Yeah, yeah. So Australia and New Zealand have publicly funded healthcare systems,
huh,
as well, and there's also
private.
the ability for private healthcare
Yes,
as
yeah, yeah,
well.
yeah. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. So,
So
and
is genetic counseling?
genetic counselling is mostly delivered through the public health system at the moment.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
That is very
yeah,
helpful, I think.
mm,
All right.
yeah.
Was that an initiative from the government, or is it something that you had to lobby with your community?
Um, so a bit of both. I think
Oh,
probably people did have to lobby for it earlier on, and certainly there is there's kind of there's the beginnings of a big piece of work happening in Australia at the moment, around how they fund and deliver genetic and genomic healthcare. So
right.
I think there's likely to be a big review there. I think there's also a smaller review happening in New Zealand. So, um, but there is access to genetic counselling and some genetic testing through the public health care system in both countries.
That is interesting, and I
Yeah,
realize that is very helpful because then there is a way to introduce genetic counseling, and
yeah,
in certain situations, there is also a
yeah,
way to channel that, because I'm sure, like in situations like cancer, it is just best to recommend it directly.
mm, yeah, yeah, and I guess it sort of depends on the kinds of treatments that are being offered, for
Mm.
example, for cancer, and how that's funded, and then does a genetic or genomic test contribute to decisions that might streamline that the cancer treatment, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah, but the health economics of all of that
Oh,
decision making is so complex.
I think so.
Yeah, well outside my skill set.
There's a whole set of different counselors for that, Professor. So
Yeah.
I'm sure. All right. So, well, I mean, thank you very much, Professor Allison. That's a lot of information and a lot of horizon opening.
Mm,
And we realized that genetic counseling itself is still growing, and in Indonesia, it is just starting to grow.
mm,
But some of us do feel that it needs to grow faster, and we need to kind of see the different direction and different perspectives than we need because of after
mm,
COVID, a lot of people starting to feel like they understand diseases. And then when they see the different variants of COVID, they start to realize what genes are.
mm.
And then it kind of grows into, oh, look, we have the same codes in
Yeah.
humans too. And then I think we're just concerned that it's growing to the wrong direction, you see.
Mm.
And it's very difficult because um maybe we haven't discussed this, and if we have time, maybe next time we can discuss about it. But I'm sure you know that in Indonesia, it's a very big country. We have like
Mm,
270 million people, and we have more
mm,
than 1,000 ethnic groups and a wide variety of educational background.
mm,
So not everyone can receive the same set of report and understand the same thing.
mm.
I think that's just another complication on how to, as you said, I think different places will have different ways on how how this
Yeah,
counseling is being delivered.
yeah.
So
And I think you're so right that, you know, and we have that when I think about how the about using genomics in New Zealand, for example, that the what the reference genome for that we want to interpret the variants against is not appropriate for the New Zealand population with Māori and Pacific people, because those people are not well represented in
genomic studies.
Yeah, in the genomic studies. And so and what you've just described for Indonesia is, another example that many of your ethnic groups won't be represented. Yeah. And so what does that mean about the interpretation of the variants?
All right, more work for me. Thank you.
More work for you. That's right. Yeah.
But
something
yeah,
else to think about. You need an expert to come and talk with you about that for your podcast.
Definitely. Thank you. All right. So, well, thank you very much, Professor Alison. That's been great. That's brilliant.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's lovely to meet you and to talk with you.
No, it's Professor Alison. I hope we didn't take too much of your precious time, but it's
absolutely.
great.
It was really good to talk with you. Thank you both for the opportunity. Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
See you later. Bye bye. Bye bye.